Good morning, everyone. Hello, and thank you so much for having me here. My name is Belle Gower, and I am an autistic educator and researcher, and the founder of Forest School SA, which is a small nature-based program operating on Paramonk land in the Adelaide Hills. We run weekly outdoor learning sessions for children from 4 years old into young adulthood. And these sessions often run in underutilized or neglected public land. So today I want to explore with you a very unexpected outcome of the work that we do at Forest School. Now, I left academia almost 10 years ago now, and it feels very strange to be back again in a space like this. But this was really just too good to not share. You may have heard of Forest School, which is a Scandinavian concept which essentially takes learning outside and invites children to re-engage in wild spaces. But generally, the kind of spaces that are used for a forest school, you can imagine pristine pine forests and beautiful flowing alpine rivers and so on, which is not really anything that I had access to when I started Forest School SA. So we got in contact with our local council area, and there was a few areas that we could use, and in the end we settled on something that was perhaps less than perfect for what we had imagined, but what came of this was really something so unexpected, and I'd love to speak with you about that now. So in Australia, over 80% of us live in urban areas. For most children, that means that they have little to no contact with unmanaged land. Yet at the same time, neglected spaces, stormwater corridors, weedy verges, forgotten council blocks make up a vast and hidden network of ecological potential. Far from being used to their potential, however, these areas are often treated as a dumping ground. Litter gathers, weeds choke the edges, and essentially these areas fall through the cracks of management and become symbols of neglect in our urban spaces, both environmentally and socially. When land is unseen, it becomes unloved, and when it is unloved, it becomes unhealthy. Most urban greening programs focus on infrastructure, not intimacy. Sure, we build, we plant, and we fence, but rarely do we create relationships. We restore landscapes without restoring connection. Now, my work begins where most environmental programs end, in the overlooked spaces between the plants. The work I'm sharing today around ecological literacy and children's connection to land as a strategy for environmental transformation is just one aspect of what we do. In fact, Forest School SA was originally founded with a completely different core goal, which was to support children who were disengaged from mainstream education. We chose to run the program outdoors because we recognised that nature offers a very flexible and embodied, a very therapeutic learning environment, and this is one that often works better for students who struggle in conventional classroom settings. What I'm presenting today has emerged as a significant additional benefit, an unanticipated outcome of creating space for children to be in long-term partnership with the land. And it's my emerging model of connection-based stewardship that I want to explore with you now. So in the years that we've been operating, we have discovered that meaningful, sustained connection to land is foundational for stewardship. And that even in marginal spaces, we can have powerful moments of learning and care where children are given time to form relationships with place. In the context of global environmental challenges, there is an increasing recognition of the importance of early and sustained connection to land as a foundation for lifelong stewardship. At Forest School SA, we propose that fostering children's place-based relationship with land, particularly in underutilised and neglected urban spaces, should be seen not only as an educational priority, but as a strategic intervention for environmental excellence. We live in a time of immense environmental urgency. Excellence in this space is often measured by large-scale interventions, infrastructure, restoration, large-scale policy. But what if a crucial and overlooked part of that strategy is letting children build real sustained relationships with the land? What if the most transformative work is happening not in pristine reserves, but on roadside verges, behind sports ovals, or in paddocks no one else wants? At Forest School SA, we have found that meaningful connection to land, especially neglected land, cultivates both care and stewardship. Children aren't just future stewards, they are already active custodians of the commons. The takeaways from my talk today are that children's connection to land can serve as a powerful, underutilized strategy for environmental excellence, not just through curriculum, but through their direct relational engagement with marginal and neglected spaces. That activating overlooked public land through child-led place-based programs reframes these sites as ecologically and socially significant, challenging conventional metrics of land value and essentially catalyzing community stewardship. And that embedding children's voices and presence in land care effort fosters long-term cultural change, supporting both truth-telling and broader community engagement with sustainability, especially where formal consultation is limited or ineffective. The theoretical foundations that we lean on when we are having this discussion are land-based pedagogy, which tells us that children don't just learn in nature, they learn with it. They form relationships through play, repetition, ritual, and observation. They develop what we would call an ecological identity, which is a felt sense of kinship and care with the land. Now, place-based attachment theory suggests that connection to place is shaped by experience over time. So it's not just where you are, but how you feel when you're there, what you notice, and who you become in that place. And very importantly, the relationship that you build over time in that place. And from environmental sociology, we know that spaces have layered meanings. What one group sees as waste, another might see as opportunity. Land use is political, cultural, social, and constantly being redefined. Bringing these strands together, I would like to propose that children are not passive recipients of environmental messaging. They are placemakers, they are meaning makers, and in the context of neglected land, they can be agents of transformation. So let's talk about the kinds of spaces I'm referring to. These are not your classic bush blocks or well-managed parks or forests. These are patches of land between infrastructure zones, roadside strips, overgrown or oddly shaped blocks too small for formal use, sites that councils label as awaiting development or non-functional. These places sit in a kind of civic blind spot. They're too scrappy for recreation, too costly for restoration, and too marginal to attract much care. And yet, children are already drawn to these spaces. As soon as they're old enough to be unsupervised, these are the first places they go. The creek behind the sports oval, the track under the power lines, the patch of scrub at the edge of town. They go there to explore, to push boundaries, to claim a sliver of autonomy. Yet without guidance or belonging, these same instincts for curiosity and freedom can turn into damage, litter, or antisocial behaviour. Not because the children lack care, but because these places are already socially devalued and young people's engagement with them has not been scaffolded through frameworks of care, responsibility, or belonging. From both a pedagogical and ecological perspective, this is the opportunity. These neglected pockets offer unpredictability, they offer complexity, and a sense of wildness that children instinctively are drawn to. When we invite children back as caretakers rather than trespassers, the same spaces that once symbolized neglect become classrooms for connection. Here are some of the spaces that we have inhabited. Now, I want to pause here and invite you to notice your own reaction. These are photos of children walking in a stormwater drain, playing in brown water that has rolled right off the freeway. Now, if you feel a flicker of discomfort, a visceral, should they be there, just hold that thought for a moment, because that response is part of the story. It reveals just how deeply our cultural definitions of safe, natural, and valuable land have narrowed. These are not, admittedly, the postcard settings of outdoor education. They're not pristine forests, manicured school gardens, and yet they are real, and perhaps most importantly, they are available. Children already move towards these spaces, often independently, because they are among the last places that offer freedom, risk, and discovery. Yet, children do so without any sanctioned framework for care, and this reflects a broader societal narrative that these landscapes are disposable. By working in these spaces intentionally, we're not simply taking education outdoors. We are intervening in that narrative. We're reframing what counts as nature, what counts as learning, and ultimately what counts as environmental responsibility. When children learn to see worth where society sees waste, they model a form of environmental excellence that begins with relationship, not regulation. What we have observed is that connection develops in stages, not as curriculum, but as a relational process. It begins with presence, children spending consistent, self-directed time in place. From that comes relationship. They begin naming, noticing, and forming emotional ties. Once relationship is established, responsibility emerges naturally. Children start cleaning, repairing, protecting, not because we tell them to, but because they care. Finally, with time and trust, we see transformation, where that sense of care extends outwards into community action and advocacy. This model shows that stewardship doesn't start with instruction or infrastructure. It starts with relationship. It is worth addressing exactly how this model differs from conventional environmental education offered in schools, because many schools do offer structured lessons on sustainability, environmental science, gardening, and yet these lessons often take place, in fact, they always take place in very controlled conditions with very clear instructional learning goals and as part of a wider unit on civic engagement. So in contrast, the model that we work with is situated rather than simulated. Children engage with unmanaged, often degraded sites where the complexity and unpredictability of the environment is not filtered out. They are experiential rather than instructive. Knowledge arises through observation, repetition, and relational time in place, not through worksheets or learning objectives. It's also emergent rather than imposed. So rather than being told what to care about, children come to care through proximity, familiarity, and embodied memory. This approach shifts the focus from teaching about care to creating the conditions in which care becomes naturalized through lived experience. And crucially, the outcomes from litter reduction to ecological awareness to broader civic engagement arise not from top-down messaging, but from bottom-up relationships. One of our current sites is a wooded corridor situated between a sports oval and a freeway. Here's a picture of it just there. It is actually quite a beautiful space. It is a narrow transitional space. It's not intended for public use and it's often overlooked in planning and maintenance. It's ecologically fragmented, weed-ridden, noisy, and so subject to litter. When we first began using the space, students treated it just as many adults passing through do, as disposable. Some were careless with rubbish, broke branches mindlessly, or trampled plants without much thought. There was no immediate sense of responsibility or connection. Over time, however, as students returned each week, a notable shift occurred. They began picking up litter voluntarily, not because they were told to, but because they felt responsible for the place. They asked questions about the plants. They learned the bird calls and the insect habitats. They started to show care, not just in behaviour, but in their attitude. This reflects the gradual development of place-based attachment and ecological literacy. Even in a degraded marginal environment, the children's growing knowledge and behavioural shifts suggest that environmental stewardship is not dependent on the quality of the site itself, but on the quality of the relationship built through time and attention. Their presence here has redefined the site socially and pedagogically, creating a meaningful space where previously there was none. From there, momentum builds organically. Families get involved, the space gains recognition. We begin small projects. Council partners take notice. Engagement follows presence. This is a quiet but powerful model of land stewardship, one that begins not with improvement for children, but with care through children. Our hope and our emerging observation is that the behaviours and values developed in these sessions are not site-dependent, but dispositional. In other words, the care children show for this particular space is not just tied to the site itself, but to a growing internalised ethic of responsibility towards land in general. While we don't yet have longitudinal data, we've begun to see indicators that these values are transferable. Families have reported that children correct others when they see litter dropped elsewhere. that children point out local plants or ecological signs outside of forest school, and that children are generally more aware of how they move through public spaces. Now, these are anecdotal, but they are consistently reported by our families. And it suggests that when connection and care are learned relationally, not abstractly, they are more likely to be applied elsewhere. Ultimately, we are not trying to create loyalty to a single patch of land. We are trying to cultivate a broader ecological identity, one that frames the children not as visitor to nature, but as someone with a responsibility to all the places they move through. One of the long-term aims of place-based environmental education is to foster enduring dispositions, not just immediate behaviour change. What we observe at Forest School SA is the formation of what I would describe as a relational ethics of care. Students begin to respond to land not as a neutral backdrop, but as something that they are in relationship with. Initially, some students treat the site as disposable, mirroring the dominant cultural cues about unregulated public space. But over time, through consistent engagement, they internalise a different norm, that land deserves attention, protection, and respect. This isn't just compliance, it's the slow emergence of ecological identity. It reminds me of the difference between a public toilet and a home toilet. Many people behave differently in a public toilet. You don't own it, it feels anonymous, someone else will clean it. But these children are growing up without that mindset. They don't see land as public in the disposable sense. They see it as something that they have a responsibility to care for, a place that they are accountable to, and that has long-term implications. These are the children who will not treat the world like a public toilet. They'll treat it like home. So what are the broader implications of this kind of education? We believe that children's presence on public land, especially neglected land, is a low-cost yet high-impact strategy for environmental transformation. It builds ecological literacy, it fosters civic pride, it invites broader community engagement, it improves neglected spaces. Children develop a nuanced understanding of ecosystems. They notice plants, seasonal change, and animal behaviour. They recognise themselves as part of these systems, forming the foundation for future stewardship. When children care for a neglected space, they begin to see it differently, and then so do others. Families take notice, councils begin to care. The place becomes a point of identity, not indifference. And that change doesn't stay isolated. Their presence reshapes the public perception of these areas. The presence of children starts a visible process of change. Litter is removed, small habitats protected, and the community begins to value the land. More importantly, it can happen without needing to fence, pave, or restore anything first. I will also add that this approach can and should be aligned with decolonisation. We are on land that has been dispossessed, renamed, and managed without Indigenous consent. And we find ourselves in the context of this asking, what does it mean to feel at home in a place that doesn't belong to you? How can love of place exist without the impulse to possess it? And how might tending land rather than taking it become a small act of reconciliation? At present, there is no framework for using neglected public land as a site for children's learning or community engagement. There is no application process, no policy language that says this kind of use is even possible. When I bring this up to councils, they don't know where to start. They don't know who to contact. And we have a big runaround every time because this is not something that's been done before. These places sit in a bureaucratic blind spot. They are too scrappy for conservation, too unregulated for schools, too undefined for community groups, and yet they are already being used. If you walk through these sites after hours, you find traces of activity, evidence of young people seeking freedom and unstructured space. They are places where boundaries are tested, identities explored, and belonging negotiated, but without guidance. And so the question society tends to ask is, how do we get kids out of these places? But perhaps the better question is, what would happen if we invited them in differently? Because the problem isn't that children and young people are drawn to these spaces. It's that we've left them without any cultural permission to care for them. Current land use frameworks privilege infrastructure and management, and yet they overlook relational engagement, the slow, place-based stewardship that emerges through continuity and care. If we are serious about environmental excellence, we need to move beyond the manicured and the managed. We need policies that make space for messy learning, for care that happens through relationship, not regulation. Right now, the spaces most in need of attention are the ones our system have made invisible. And the young people who could transform them are the ones we keep pushing out. So the question isn't, should children be in these places? It's how can we support them to belong there, safely, purposefully, and with care. For planners, educators, or environmental managers, the takeaway is this: before you invest in infrastructure, invest in presence. Invite the children in, let connection take root. The care will follow, and so will the transformation. Thank you.